Okay, so I think this lecture is probably going to be the hardest of all of the ones that we're going to go through. It's going to be, we're really focusing on the worldview and the ideologies that ground the social justice movement. And so as we've been doing, we started with the biblical worldview, gave us some ideas and some truths to kind of understand justice biblically. It went through, obviously, biblical justice in the Bible. And now we're coming to social justice in the worldview that defines social justice and informs social justice. And the two worldviews that we're really going to be paying attention to are postmodernism and Marxism. You've obviously probably heard of both of these. We all know what Marxism is. Postmodernism, you've probably heard that before. The issue with postmodernism, and we're going to find this out pretty soon here, is that it's extremely hard to understand. Like, one of the most convoluted and confusing and ridiculous ideologies and worldviews you're ever going to come across. And primarily because it believes in relativism, that truth is relative. And so what you're going to find is that it's just inconsistent everywhere. There's nothing really coherent and cohesive about it. So it gets really hard to analyze it and to think about it and to understand it. And part of the issue, too, is that the postmodern thinkers, they have such a critical view of language and the use of language and how language communicates meaning and truth. And so they end up kind of like tearing their own worldview apart because they're using language to try to explain what they believe about their worldview, yet they also believe within this worldview that you can't really understand language or you can't really communicate truth anyway. So it just gets really hard to kind of untangle all this stuff. But nonetheless, these are the worldviews that are kind of undergirding the social justice worldview and the social justice movement. So Marxism and postmodernism, they've kind of been married. And this is weird because these two ideologies, these two worldviews are actually contradictory. They're not the same. They should not mesh together well. So we're going to see that this is a very odd marriage. And people today are pulling from both of these, though, to kind of formulate their reasoning behind what they're doing. And so we're going to start with just a brief philosophical history of worldview. Pre-modernism was what we would think of as before the 1700s, and this really was, for most of human history, the philosophy, you could say, that dominated it, and it's characterized by transcendent reality. So people believed in a God, and a God was the one that obviously gave truth, that communicated right and wrong, and provided the means to ground objective reality or an objective truth. And then after pre-modernism, we come to the Enlightenment of the 1700s, and that gave rise to modernism. And in modernism, we see these kind of different ideologies of humanism rise up, romanticism, liberalism, Marxism. These are modern ideas, modern ideologies. Romanticism, we're going to get to that a little bit later, but that's starting to actually drift more closely to what we would call today as postmodernism. And so these modernism, postmodernism, pre-modernism, they're periods of time, but they're also ideologies or worldviews. So right now we're in the postmodern period of time because we're after the modern period of time, but postmodernism itself is also an ideology. It's also a worldview. So there's two ways to think about postmodernism: period of time and a worldview. And so a little bit more of some specific history on the Enlightenment. Again, started in the 1700s. It's marked by reason and rationalism. If you remember from our brief introduction on worldview, how I gave the three pillars of a worldview. You got the metaphysic, which is the fundamental nature of reality. You have the epistemology, how do you know what you know? And then you have the ethics. So with the Enlightenment comes, it's marked by reason and rationalism. So that would be the epistemology. How do you know what you know? By reason, by logic, by syllogistic arguments. And so we can use our minds to come to know what is true. This is very humanistic, and so humanism was a characteristic which is defined as an outlook or a system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. So again, that's how it's contrary to the pre-modern time where everything was grounded in a transcendent being or a supernatural being. So humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. So modernism was certainly marked by humanistic thinking. And so a little bit more on modernism. Again, the Great Enlightenment sparked it. Science and technology advanced. Man's confidence in himself as the finder of truth increased. So obviously in this modern time period, you have like Darwin and the theory of Darwinism. You have the Industrial Revolution. You have all these advancements in technology that are starting to give man confidence in himself. Like, man, look at what we're doing. Look how much we're discovering. Look how much we're figuring out about the world and about even the universe and telescopes, and we can study stars, and all this stuff is giving man kind of making him prideful and think that he can actually figure truth out by himself. So this resulted obviously in atheism and claims that we no longer need God. Maybe you've heard the famous claim from Nietzsche that God is dead, and he was a famous philosopher in this modern time period as well. So man no longer needs God. Man just needs himself. So people still believed in absolute truths, though, and would make absolute claims such as God does not exist. So it's an absolute objective claim. They're claiming that he does not exist. And so, again, very atheistic in this time period. The modern period peaked with the world wars and Marxism. And basically, if all we are is material, then there must be a material and economic cause for all human problems, which means that if our problems are caused by material and economic things, then the solutions should be material and economic. And so Karl Marx, we're going to get to him a little bit later here, but he reduced the human condition to issues of class struggle, economic exploitation. He moved from humanism really to an anti-humanistic view, and that really culminated in the loss of individualism. Everyone would just kind of get lost in this larger group. So individuality kind of goes away, and it becomes this anti-humanistic society. And then ultimately that leads to the murder of millions and millions of people. So modernism really just crashed and burned with the experiment of communism and the experiment of Marxism. And so you have Karl Marx coming up with this Marxist ideology. We're going to get to that more specifically. But then you have Russia, Lenin, Stalin applying it to their country. You have Mao applying it to China. Obviously, you see it applied in Cambodia and Vietnam and all these other places, North Korea, Cuba. All these places are applying this modern and this Marxist ideology, and it just crashed and burned. Millions of people died, and so it was just a boom, modern period, done, blew up. So that brings us to postmodernism. And that was really started at the end of the World Wars and the fall of communism. It ushered in this period of time. People discovered that we are more than just material, and we can't just be explained by science and reason. We're not just sacks of chemicals. We have emotions, we have desires, we have wills. We want to express ourselves. So it led to this kind of this wanting to be free, and obviously it led to the sexual revolution and drugs and experimenting with LSD and all that stuff and trying to figure out who you are and all these crazy religions and existential experiences and things like that and hippies. It led to hippies. So, So that, along with the ultimate failure of reason and science shown by communism, caused people to look for different answers for the meaning of life and purpose and things like that. So, born in the minds of French philosophers in the mid-20th century came postmodernism as the ideology and as the worldview. And so now what we're going to do is, now we're really going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of postmodernism. So again, if you need me to stop, if we want to ask questions about some of these things, these tenets of postmodernism, just stop me. Let's talk about it, because it can get really confusing and really convoluted. These are ideas that are just so foreign to the Christian worldview that it's going to come off as very just like unintelligible right away. So it'll take us a little bit to really kind of grasp it. But I'm going to look at. Yep.
Point something up there real quick. It's not that all the ideas of modernism are gone.
Right.
So can you talk about that for a little bit?
We'll get to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. Certainly not all the. Obviously, we know this because we still do science, we still use reason, we still have mathematics, we're still advancing in technology and medical science. That's all modern ideas. It's all based on a modern epistemology of how you discover truth. So that's still so integrated in our society. But it's weird, once we get to the social justice movement, you'll start to see that they're starting to attack mathematics. They're starting to attack logic. They're starting to attack science and be skeptical of it because it has been deemed an oppressive tool. But yes.
But key to postmodern thought too is we don't need God to discover truth.
Right. God is out of both of them. God doesn't exist in either of these ultimate worldviews. So he's out of the picture. He was out of the picture at the Enlightenment. So we're going to look at three French philosophers that are kind of like the guys for the invention, really, of this postmodern ideology. Again, French philosophers, mid-20th century. The first one is, what is it, Jacques? I don't know how to pronounce French names. Is it Jacques? Yeah. Okay, Jacques. Derrida or whatever. So, 1930 to 2004, that's when he lived. He saw, I'll have to explain this a little bit, he saw hierarchical binaries of superiority and subordination that he believed exist within language. So, again, saw hierarchical binaries of superiority and subordination that he believed exist within language. So he saw, what does that mean? He saw language as having these binary categories, and I'll have an example here in a little bit, but basically a perfect example of this is man and woman. You have this binary language of man and woman, and that language is used to actually create a superiority and subordination type power structure. So the fact that we have these binaries in our language forces some type of like oppression in society. Men are going to suppress and oppress women just by the binariness in language. So it's a very interesting idea. He introduced the concept of deconstruction, and so you can think of just the idea of construction. You construct something, you build something up, you make it, you form it. So deconstruction is obviously tearing something down, revealing, trying to find like what's inside, what is the structure of this building. You deconstruct it, take it down from the outside in, and to figure out what's underneath it. And so he did this with language, and basically you take language and you take words, you take paragraphs, and you deconstruct it to expose the intended power play. And so to Derrida, basically everything was about power. Language was used to keep power, to oppress people, and there's always going to be this intended power play in language. And basically, whatever it was, you're looking to deconstruct the language in order to find out how is this keeping some people in power and how is this oppressing other people. Everything was about a power play. So language does not actually represent reality. We'll see it doesn't actually correspond to reality. It doesn't need to correspond to reality. All it needs to do is keep some people in power and oppress other people. And so here's that example again. So the binary language of man and woman is intended to subordinate woman to man in the patriarchal system. And you see that with all sorts of things, right and wrong, good and evil, all this binary type language. Michel Foucault.
I think we still see a lot of that playing with language to.
Oh yeah. This is a primary aspect that we're going to see continuing to play out today in the social justice movement. Michel Foucault, he was one of the most famous homosexuals in history. 1926 to 1984 he lived. Again, a French philosopher. So you're going to see very similar themes with his thinking as Derrida. He taught on the relationship between language, knowledge, and power. Again, everything's about language and power. He saw the socio-political power as the determiner of what is true. So your politics, the people who are in power in your government, they really determine what is true by their use of language. So if they have control, that means they have control of the language of a society and of a culture, and that language then is used to keep the power structure. So it's not God. God doesn't determine what is true. It's not some objective standard. It's not a correspondence with reality. It doesn't actually have to fit reality. And that's going to be, again, a common theme. So he coined the term power knowledge in 1981. He came up with this idea of an episteme. It comes from epistemology. How do we know what we know? So it's a dominant set of ideas and values that shape how we identify and interact with knowledge. So again, a dominant set of ideas and values that shape how we identify and interact with knowledge. And so each culture has an episteme which frames their knowledge. So that's where we start to get this idea that knowledge and truth is relative. It's relative to a culture, it's relative to a people, it's relative to a group. And all these groups and all these people have an episteme. They have this dominant set of ideas. And that ideas and this dominant set of ideas is really informed by their language. And the language really keeps this power structure in these societies. So we can't just say, again, according to the postmodernists, that this culture's ideas and their knowledge and what they think is true is wrong, because it's created, it's socially constructed by their language. So this really means that knowledge is local, not transcendent. And again, this is important because we as Christians, fundamentally in our worldview, we believe that knowledge comes from the transcendent mind of God. So this idea of local knowledge, like I know something and it's localized to me and nobody else can know this. It's not universal. It's not objective. It's not transcendent. It's not outside of me and my experience and my story, you could say. And you can kind of take that a little further into just groups and socio groups and cultural groups. They have a knowledge that's formed by their language and by their culture, and it's localized to them. Another group will not know this knowledge. They cannot know this knowledge because they're outside of that group.
Is that where Gnosticism comes?
It's kind of ingrained with Gnosticism, this idea of secret knowledge. Yep, exactly. Yep. So, again, no one can get out of their local reality and biases. We all have these biases. They're informed and constructed by the language that we're in and the culture that we're in. We'll never be able to escape it. We can never get out of it. It's just the way it is, according to the postmodernists. Then it brings us to, again, however you pronounce it, Jean-François Lyotard or something like that. I don't know. Again, similar lifespan, 1924, 1999. Again, mid-20th century was when he had his heyday. And so he had this idea of, really he critiqued science and the Enlightenment and Marxism. So he had, a very critical view of the modern ideology, the modern way of thinking about truth. He did not like science. He did not like Marxism. And we'll see why here in just a second. He's known for his definition of postmodernism. This is actually a really famous definition of postmodernism, which is a skepticism towards meta-narratives. And a meta-narrative is really like an overarching story, an overarching truth that is true universally for everyone. And so Christianity is a meta-narrative because we believe that it's true universally, that there's nowhere you can go in the universe or in this world that God doesn't exist, that he isn't the ultimate reality. Again, think back to our Christian metaphysic, absolute personality of God, creature and creator distinction, the Trinity and things like that. So that is our ultimate reality, and that is a meta-narrative. And Lyotard, he was skeptical of any worldview or ideology that was a meta-narrative. And now Marxism was a meta-narrative and is a meta-narrative. That's why postmodernism and Marxism are like oil and water, and they should be contradictory, yet we'll see how they mesh here in a little bit, but he was skeptical of anything that was a meta-narrative. So he saw a strict interlinkage between the language of science and that of politics and ethics. So he saw science and really just our scientific language, how we talk about what we observe and what we believe to be true based upon our scientific investigation and empirical studies. Again, he was very skeptical of that. He saw all of that language as just a way to keep the power in a society. And obviously, we determine, and more modern worldviews and more modern societies, they determine their ethics, again, based upon scientific investigation, scientific study. And so he, again, was very skeptical of that. So here's just some key elements of postmodernism that we can kind of get from these three guys as we start to think about it more concretely here. There's an infinite number of ways to interpret the world. This is where we really get the idea of relativism. So in my sphere of language and culture, I interpret the world this way, and then a different group of people with their different language and use of words, they interpret the world a different way. And nobody can actually say that, well, my interpretation is right. Everybody has their own, and it's relative. So there is an infinite number of ways to interpret the world. Reality is simply a social construct. There is no actual reality. Language creates reality for a particular group. Again, very relativistic. Again, all about language. So think of it this way. God exists relative to Christians. God does not exist relative to the atheists. And so in our Christian cultural bubble, you could say, we have a certain way of thinking about how we come to know truth. We have a worldview. We have an epistemology. We believe in revelation. We believe that God communicates. And because we believe that, and that's our language, and that's our world that we live in, we're going to come to the conclusion that God exists. But again, that's just all relative to our language and the way we think about things. It's not actually true. It's not actually reality. Again, this is postmodernist thinking. And so that's the same with the atheist. It's the same with anybody. So again, there's nobody can actually say that they're right. There is no such thing as right. There is no such thing as ultimate reality. So again, postmodernism rejects meta-narratives. They would reject Christianity in its claim that it has ultimate truth. And so again, skeptical and cynical of anything claiming to be a meta-narrative. Everything is reduced to a struggle for power. Language is to construct a reality which favors some over others. So when reading, think about language now, think about reading a book. When reading, the reader, the audience, so you have an author and you have an audience, you have a reader, has the ability to interpret the author in any way they so desire. Thus, there is no intended meaning. So they don't believe that I can write something and intend one meaning. It's actually up to the interpreter to determine what they think is the meaning for them based upon how they deconstruct the language and how they come to know things in their sphere of knowledge and their sphere of language. The self is simply a bundle of social roles. So you're a wife, a teacher, a mother, an American, a North Dakotan, and these roles are all constructed by a society's language. One cannot escape their language and their social construct. You'll never be able to escape these roles, these identities that are informed by your society and by your language. This basically means that the self is social, not individual. So you are part of your group. Your identity is your group. You don't actually have an individual, autonomous identity. You are just assimilated into whatever the language is, whatever the culture is that you're in. Again, you will never escape your biases. So here's another way to think about this word thing. Words refer to other words, which refer to other words, which means words are socially related to other words and do not actually refer to a real object or things in reality. So, and that's really Derrida's idea. Because, how do you define a word? You define it with words. And how do you define those words in the definition of that word? Well, you use other words to define those words. And so it's just like an infinite regress, and really he comes to the point where, well, there's just no meaning. And obviously we know that's not true. God is the originator of words and language, and he has revealed truth propositionally through words. And he obviously causes us or allows us to understand and know things. So
by his own definitions of words, everything he said is meaningless.
Exactly, that's the problem. And that's why you start to see all this contradiction. They try to communicate what they actually believe. They say, like, oh, truth is relative, infinite number of ways to interpret reality, and I have the liberty to interpret that however I want. And so because maybe I grew up in a Judeo-Christian worldview, I'm going to interpret that a certain way, but that's just because I'm in my bubble, and I can't escape my bubble, and I can't escape my biases, and I can't escape how I think about knowledge and I think about truth. And so it's really this trap. There's nowhere to go, and it's just horrible. It's really awful. But yeah, very dire and glib. So Pluckrose and Lindsay, they wrote this book pretty recently, published in 2020, called Cynical Theories. It's probably one of the best books out there right now with good scholarship on postmodernism and how it leads to the social justice agenda today. They say this is a quote from them: "The postmodern term brought about an important shift away from the modernist dichotomy between the objective universal and the subjective individual and toward local narratives and the lived experiences of their narrators. In other words, the boundary between that which is objectively true and that which is subjectively experienced ceased to be accepted. Knowledge, truth, meaning, and morality are therefore, according to postmodernist thinking, culturally constructed and relative products of individual cultures, none of which possess the necessary tools or terms to evaluate the others. So I have no right to go outside of my worldview, my Christianity, to then assess other worldviews and other ideas and other cultures. So we're going to look at some kind of core principles. Again, this is from cynical theories. 2 core principles. 1, postmodern knowledge principle, and it's this: radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism. So basically, you could say that in our modern society that elevates science and reason, we have culturally constructed this idea that the earth revolves around the sun. And we say that's true for us. But basically what they're saying, this commitment to cultural constructivism, is if a different culture comes up with a different way to interpret reality, and the way they come to know what is true, they come to the conclusion that no, the sun revolves around the earth, well, you can't actually critique that, because there really is no ultimate reality. And there is no way that you can say, well, we got it figured out, and you don't. So that's the idea of cultural constructivism. 2, the postmodern political principle, a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. So those in power who control the language, they form this hierarchy, and they just use their language to keep the power. And it's always implied that they do. There's never this. It's always a power play. It's always a power structure, and it's just the way it is to the postmodernists. It's kind of dog-eat-dog world, and it's.
So their take on things trumps everything.
Well, that's the irony of it, and the contradiction of it is, like, they're saying these things absolutely. They're saying them with absolute certainty, which is a contradiction because they don't believe in absolute certainty. Right. So it's just a mess. Yeah. It's just bad. And then there's 4 major themes in postmodernism. So 2 major principles, 4 major themes. First one is this: the blurring of boundaries. Where you really start to see this fleshed out today is in queer theory. Theory, capital T-H-E-O-R-Y, theory, is another way to describe postmodernism. It's another word to refer to postmodernism. So in queer theory, this is where you really start to see this blurring of boundaries. There is no binary things. You can be whatever you want. There's nothing. You don't have a specific heterosexual identity or sexuality or anything like that. It blurs the boundaries of truth and of knowledge and things like that. So another major theme is the power of language. Again, we've talked about that a lot. Language is what's used to keep power structures in place, to oppress some and to benefit others. Cultural relativism. So basically this idea that no set of cultural norms can be said to be better than another. I can't critique the culture of Muslims in the Middle East. That's their culture. It's constructed by their language, and there's no way that I can actually say that what they do is wrong. So cultural relativism, and 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. So again, we just are assimilated into our group, into our culture, into our language. There is no individual. And again, it's the loss of the universal. So again, no transcendent truth, no transcendent reality, no God, no objective truth.
Sam, does that just create one stalemate after another?
Yes, it does. So we're going to get into this. Yep, that's good. So
it makes it really hard to have any meaningful dialogue.
Exactly.
Say something like abortion, like even if you're trying to prove that's a living life, at some point they go, maybe it is, but who's to say it's wrong to kill it if I don't want it?
Right, exactly. And you'll get into conversations like that on campus where people are just so apathetic about anything, and you're like, really? And it's postmodernism. But it's a problem because it creates this world where there really is no purpose to live. There's no purpose to do anything. There's no meaning in life. What do I do? Everything's just relative. Why do anything at all? Why have any purpose? And we're going to get into that.
It's really kind of a lazy, amoebic position.
Exactly.
It's the position that I don't have to take a position on anything.
Yep, exactly. And that's what the critique of the postmodernists was, is they just get to sit in their ivory towers and their academies and just philosophize about all these ideas and this stupid stuff that really doesn't help society at all. And it was just people said it's just very boring. Like, this is a very boring idea and a very boring worldview. But it made its grounds and it made its way. So again, remember the metaphysic, epistemology, ethic, pillars. We're going to kind of categorize postmodernism here again, according to those. So metaphysics, all things are socially constructed, language, identity, class. All groups are in a power struggle. Individuals do not fundamentally exist. All are a part of a group. So this idea of unity over diversity. Remember, a part of our metaphysic in Christianity is this reality that God is a unity and a diversity. He is one God, three persons. So these things are both true. As soon as you start to drift one way or the other, you get into some problems. And so the postmodernists, they obviously hold to unity over diversity. Everything is just kind of this one blobby mess. You're just part of your group. There's no individual identity. There's obviously no transcendence. So God is out of the picture in the postmodern worldview. Epistemology, it's postmodern existentialism. It's just kind of based upon my feelings and based upon my language and things like that. And we call this standpoint epistemology. And this is related to this local knowledge idea. Like, I take a standpoint. I'm a specific, you could say, stake in the ground. I'm this one point, and I think about reality, and I come to truth from my position and my feelings and my standpoint, and I don't care about anybody else. Nobody else can inform it. And again, think about the group identity too. No other group can inform another group's how they come to truth. And again, it's very much feelings-based, existential, not rational, not empirical. And then their ethic, morality is socially constructed and thus relative. So they really don't have a consistent ethic. They say, well, whatever that culture is and whatever they decided is their morality, can't really critique it. It's constructed by their language, and the people in power who control the language, they determine what the ethic is. They determine what's right and wrong. And they think that they oppress people with their use of the language to keep themselves in power, and that's just the way that the world works. So again, there's no critique. There really is no objective morality. So very purposeless, very boring, very like, what's the meaning of life? What's going on here? So it's a problem. Now this is, if you remember that diagram from the first session we looked at with, as it relates to epistemology, if you remember the idea that our closed world, the top was taken off and God communicates revelation and truth into our world. This is different. This is obviously a closed world. God doesn't exist. And there's all these different groups of people, cultural groups, societies. And truth is determined, obviously, relative to these different groups. And so some groups, you can see some are going to be bigger than others, and those are the groups that are in power. And they use their language to oppress the other groups and to keep other people in place. And it's always about the power play. And so this is this idea, again, of local knowledge and local biases. And then you can never get out of your little bubble. You can't escape it. You can't critique other bubbles. It's just the way it is in postmodernism. So, postmodernism's evolution. It has to change. It's not sustainable. It doesn't provide any meaning for life, any motivation to do anything at all. So what happened? It needed more structure to survive. It attached itself to the worldview of Marxism, which again is weird because Marxism is a meta-narrative. But it attached it to Marxism, especially in ethics. So it kind of stole the ethics of Marxism, which gave it now purpose and meaning and a goal, something to do. This really birthed the marriage of Marxism and postmodernism. It birthed the social justice movement, which is obviously what we're critiquing in this whole class. And so this social justice movement, they adopted social justice language from the civil rights movement. So they weren't really the civil rights people. They were the postmodernist scholars Marxists who kind of molded this together, and they adopted this language and came up with their own goals. So really, it turned the metaphysic and the epistemology of postmodernism, what we call theory, into critical theory, which is from Marxism, which critically examines systems of power and knowledge. So it sought to reconstruct knowledge, truth, and societies according to the new theorist narratives best defined by the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School, a group of Marxists associated with the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. This is the name of the main scholars at the Frankfurt School. Not really that important. They applied Marxism to radical interdisciplinary social theory. They expanded on Karl Marx's conflict theory and applied it more broadly, including other social sciences and philosophy. And so we're going to get into Marxism here in just a moment. And their main goal was to address structural issues causing inequity. And so we're starting to see this idea of inequality and inequity and differences between people that needs to be addressed. So Marxism, it is a meta-narrative. Everything is material. Humans are machines which require naturalistic solutions to problems, destroy and build new structures and systems. Everything is conflict. Conflict is essential to Marxist ideology. You don't have any evolution or any change or any growth in a society unless there is conflict. So there has to be conflict. And we see this conflict in all sorts of different ways. Bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie were the capitalists, the people who owned the companies, who made all the money, and the proletariat were the working class who worked for the capitalists. Obviously, capitalists were socialists, oppressor versus oppressed, all these different conflicts going on in societies, and that is necessary to Marxism. You need the conflict.
What did you say the main goal was? A couple of slides back.
Their main goal was to address structural issues causing inequity. Yep.
Is there a time period where you'd say social justice was birthed? You said it was birthed, but can you put a time on that?
Yeah, it's going to be right around the 70s and 80s. And so especially with when you start to see these legal scholars, and we're going to get a little bit more into the invention of really critical race theory and critical theory in general in the next session. But yeah, it's going to be 70s, 80s, and 90s when it really kind of started to get into the mainstream of things and out of the academy. So a couple philosophers that we have to think about here that kind of, again, inform Marxism. Again, another French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. You maybe heard of him, Rousseau. He was called the professional hypocrite. He was an evil, vile, horrible, wicked man. One of the worst men to ever live, probably. He is the intellectual forerunner of Karl Marx. He saw in the state the key to utopia. He formulated the idea of the social contract, where the individual is obligated to alienate himself with all his rights to the whole community, to the state. The state is the Messiah capable of making the new man. So very kind of religious language here. How do we believe, and how is a new man truly made? Through the gospel, through regeneration, through being born again, through the work of Christ. That's how you become a new man. But Rousseau saw that as something that could be done by the state. He is the key, how do you say that word? Progenitor of the French Revolution and Romanticism. And so the French Revolution was really what informed the Russian Revolution, where we see communism birthed. And he saw societal institutions as the corrupting force of an intrinsically good individual. So you have all these societal institutions like schools and churches and all these religious institutions and the family and all these things in societies, and he saw these things as corrupting individuals. So individuals are, maybe I have it here. Oh, no, I don't have it. Individuals are really born good. Oh, yeah, intrinsically good. They're born good. They're born at kind of a clean slate. And really, the purpose of life is kind of self-actualization. Like, you just got to experience, really, sex was a big part of that. And Sigmund Freud kind of pulled out of this a little bit too. But the idea of any institution that starts to impose its norms on an individual, like, say, Christianity or the church saying, hey, sex before marriage is sinful. Like that's actually, he believes that as corrupting an individual and making him less than a true human being. It's destroying humanity in his mind. So we need to get rid of all these institutions in societies. And he believed that we can do this by having one overarching utopian state that kind of gets rid of all these different institutions. And so Karl Marx pulled a lot from Rousseau. He combined Hegel as I should have probably had a slide on him. He was another really important philosopher during that time. But he combined Hegel's dialectic, which is basically the idea that all things are in a process of continual change. So things are changing, with Feuerbach's materialism, place material things over ideas. So Hegel basically believed that ideas are in constant fluctuation. So Marx pulled from that fluctuation of Hegel, and then Feuerbach's idea that material things are placed over ideas. I'm kind of confusing right now, but nonetheless. Basically, thus to him, all things are in material flux, not ideological flux, not spiritual flux, but material flux. Was big to his thought process. So this resulted in his idea that history is dominated by class struggle and conflict. And materially, again, think socioeconomically, how much money do you make type of thing, what types of things do you have access to, what type of material things and material goods do you have access to, and there's all this fluctuation in that economic realm. And this is, again, this class struggle and this class conflict. So, I said I have Marx there. Marx sought to end class systems and free the proletariat, again, the working class, from their chains of labor. So capitalism alienates the individual from true freedom. And I'll explain this a little bit. The more one produces, the less one consumes. So if you're stuck working for somebody and you're making this person, this capitalist, this bourgeoisie money, you're not able to consume what you want to consume. You're kind of like a slave to this capitalist. So the labor alienates the individual from being fully human. Private property for him became the tangible material expression of alienated human life. Very interesting idea. Marx did not like that capitalism created surplus value or profit. So in his mind, you basically it's kind of like this idea of like a nonprofit institution where you work just enough to cover what you need to cover for the materials and for what you need to live, and anything beyond that, obviously in a capitalistic society, anything beyond that would go to the person who owned the company. So if a person worked 6 hours and that 6 hours was able to make what he needed to make to cover everything, you could say, and break even, let's say he worked 2 more hours in the day and that extra 2 hours of work went to the gain of the business owner, he saw that as absolutely just wicked and horrible. He just hated that idea, that some people could be making money and gaining profit off of the expense of other people's work. And so Marxism sees the oppression as top-down from the capitalist, the business owner type person, all the way down to the working class. However, we're going to see this in a little bit. The social justice movement tweaks this and sees oppression as structural. So it's not top-down. It's not the people in charge oppressing the people underneath. It's actually this oppression is in everything. It's structural. It's literally like a cancer in our bones, and we can't escape it. And we can't help but oppress people. We can't help but try to keep our power. And this is going to be a really big idea that we're going to flesh out here in a little bit. We actually might flesh it out more in the next session.
I have a question.
Yep.
You said on the last slide at the end, you said sees oppression as structural.
Yep.
Would that mean that oppression is innate, like the desire to oppress others is innate in every human being? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of their original sin?
Yep, exactly. And you can't, even if it's unconscious or subconscious, you can't avoid it. Like, it's not even about consciously and intending to oppress somebody. It's just a part of who you are. And you can't escape your identity group. You can't escape how you are just basically born, depending on which group you're in, you're born to either oppress or you're born to be oppressed, and you can't get out of it.
So that's an absolute bit.
To them it is, yeah. Yep, exactly.
Well, I was just
Yep, and because Marxism is a meta-narrative and does believe in objective reality, the postmodernists kind of steal that objectivity from Marxism and say, no, this is actually really happening. This is real. There really is real oppression, and it's really tangible in these different groups.
Just one quick comment.
Yep.
Like, if they really think that, then again, I know we're pointing out contradictions up
Yep.
here, but like, right now, only one group can oppress another, right? So like, let's say that they view people of color as those who are oppressed.
Yep.
They can't, I don't know, is it just because of the state we're in that their desire to oppress cannot be expressed in a way? Or are they
Right.
just forgetting that?
They're not forgetting it. They're just saying it's totally ingrained into who you are. So, say the white, housewife who, homeschools her kids and, volunteers at the, whatever, the food pantry, I don't know, whatever. Does good things, helps out her community, isn't like racist, would never think that she has, she doesn't have any idea or any belief that somebody's inferior to her because of the color of her skin, but just based on the fact that she's white, she's an oppressor, and she can't escape it. She might not even think about it. She might not even think she is oppressing, but it's just who she is. And it's informed by her identity, it's informed by her language. And because she's white, she has, you could say, she owns the language. It's very interesting. We're going to flesh it out a little bit more here. It's going to get a little bit more clarity.
If I can
Yep.
help answer David's question. So this is what I've been told from a friend in the postmodern thought and the social justice camp. So the answer that they gave me to that was, in the United States, all white people are inherently systemically racist.
Right.
But in China, it would not be that. It would
Right.
not be that way. The white people would not be racist systemically in China. It would be different.
Right, because they're in a different.
There would be different oppressed people.
They're in a different group. They're in a different bubble. They're in a different local knowledge, and we can't critique them. They can't critique us. So we. Exactly, and it's arbitrary because it's just who's determining who has the power. That's what's funny, and it'll certainly change. This isn't.
Is this indirectly causing World War III?
It could. Certainly could. So Marxist pillars, again, back to our three pillars, meta-narrative. Not meta-narrative, that's supposed to be metaphysics, sorry. Metaphysic, everything is material, humans are ultimate, they're the supreme divinity. Humans are the supreme divinity in Marxism. Human nature is fundamentally about meeting needs, food, water, and clothing. Human consciousness is formulated through struggle with nature. It is evolutionary, it's pantheistic, and it's materialistic. So that's the meta-narrative, the absolute reality of Marxism. Their epistemology, this is actually really confusing. It's actually really hard to figure out what their epistemology is. It seems like it's rationalism because it's a modern worldview, but again, it's really hard to determine. You would think that it would be empirical as well, but Marx explicitly said that he hates empiricism. So whatever, take it or leave it, I don't know. Their ethic, and this is very clear, it's utilitarian. So basically the idea that the end justifies the means. So we have this end in mind. What's the end? Overturning the power structures, liberating the working class, and putting them in power, and whatever means brings that end is justified. It's moral and right. So that's their ethic. And so remember what I said, postmodernism is stealing the ethic of Marxism. This is a really important term here, hegemony. Hegemony, whatever. Man, I'm bad tonight. Hegemony. Antonio Gramsci, he was an Italian Marxist philosopher, journalist, linguist, writer, whatever. He coined this term, and he was part of the Communist Party in Italy. Basically, it's this idea that structure and systems that it's structure and systems that protect the privilege of the oppressor group. Language, food, dress, logic, mathematics, laws, family structure, whatever it is. etc. It could be anything, are all part of hegemonic power structures. So for us today in our culture, it's the white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian. He is the ultimate hegemonic group. And so I would assume that many of you in here will find that you are that guy. And many of you women are almost the ultimate hegemonic group. But you're a woman, so you get to, you don't qualify there.
You want to define cisgender?
Cisgender is basically you're not transgender. You are the gender that you were born as. So if you're born a male, your gender is male, you're cisgender. Transgender, obviously, if you're born female and you identify, or born male, identify female, or born female, identify male, you would not be cisgender, you'd be transgender. So any cultural things associated with this group are deemed a tool to keep power and privilege. So for some weird reason, I think it's this next thing. Yeah, logic is a white thing. It's odd. You've maybe heard this in the news before. It's something that's talked about a lot right now. Logic is for some reason connected to Western culture and European culture, and therefore it's a hegemonic tool used to oppress other groups. And if you want to liberate the oppressed group, you got to get rid of logic. So you're starting to see that today. Capitalism was a tool thought to oppress the proletariat. Thus, it must be destroyed to liberate the working class. The Christian definition of marriage and family is hegemonic. Thus, it must be destroyed, BLM. That's why, if you remember, obviously they took away these statements off their website, but they used to have very clear statements that we seek to overturn the nuclear family structure. That was on BLM's website. They seek to basically empower queer folk, they say. So they're totally advocating this hegemonic overturning thing. Whatever has been connected to, whatever arbitrarily has been identified as the group in power, and whatever, again, they're tools, you could say. If white people use logic, well, we got to get rid of logic. If white people have nuclear families, we got to get rid of nuclear families. If white people really have a high value of marriage, we got to get rid of marriage. If most white people are heterosexual, we got to get rid of that. It just goes on. So Christianity is obviously hegemonic, but the Christian view of sexuality is as binary is hegemonic. Got to get rid of it. So must embrace LGBTQIA plus identities. Heterosexuality, so even just being a heterosexual, you think that, hey, all these different, this plethora of sexual identities, you think that heterosexuality would have its place in the plethora of identities, but no, heterosexuality is actually hegemonic, so it doesn't have its place, it's oppressive, and it needs to be overturned. It's wicked to them.
Well, Sam, you said that BLM used to have? Did you say used to have?
Used to, they got rid of it because they got so much flack over it.
Oh, really?
Yep. So you can find places that obviously copied and pasted or took screenshots of their website, but they no longer have these core tenets on their website. But everybody saw them anyway, so everybody knows. You can just probably Google it and find them. So the Christian view of male and female roles are hegemonic. You start to see this a lot in churches today. This idea of men as leaders and authorities in the family and in the church is evil. It's hegemonic. Thus, it must be overthrown in favor of egalitarianism and feminism. So that's why you start to see this idea that, hey, we need women pastors as well, because in order to overthrow this hegemonic, power structure, we need to have egalitarianism. We need to have women also as preachers. So all this is informing what we see today in the church, the liberalism in the church.
It's really insanity.
Oh, it is. It's very insane. It's very insane. That's why it's so absurd. And we're going to start to see where this has been, the fifth session, we're going to start to see where this has been deeply applied to the church and to our ministry organizations, and it's really insidious and gross, and you're like, how can people who profess to be Christians, especially Christian leaders, adopt these ideologies because they're very just blatantly anti-Christian?
And can't they see ahead that once they destroy all this hegemony, the next one's going to take its place?
Oh, right, and that's the problem. It's like, okay, you overthrow all the power structures and you put a new group in power, well then, according to your system, now you have to overthrow that power group, and it's never ending. It's just, there's no end to it. There's no salvation, really. It's horrible. It's really horrible. And that's why, obviously, when you see, at least in Marxist countries, when they apply that type of ethic, to their society where we're going to overthrow the power structure, it leads to just millions and millions and millions of people dying. It's just the way it goes, because we're all depraved and we're all sick human beings, and when you let people go in that type of direction, it's just going to be chaos. So, because of Marxism's focus on materialism, all disparity was judged on economic grounds. Injustice is defined as differences in socioeconomic status. The existence of different social classes was the ultimate evil. The goal of Marxism is to create economic equality of outcome. We see this a lot today. Reparations, welfare system. Again, back to that idea of like a basic income. Let's give people money. Let's get rid of these economic inequalities. Utilitarianism means that the end justifies the means. This is just all review again. If the end is right and the means to the end is right, then the means to the end is right. Genocide. The end is utopia. So we're going to briefly look at this idea of utopia because it's important to any Marxist ideology. And you hear people really it's really what they want. The goal is utopia. And to them, a utopia is complete equality. Classless systems, you could say. And so though you're overthrowing the power structures, they're seeking to overthrow them in order to create a society where there is no power structure and everybody's equal, but that's impossible. Somebody has to be in power. And so what ends up happening is you have the government, I'm jumping ahead. Let's get into this. Yeah.
I was going to say, you say equality, but I think we need to be careful with equity and equality because equality would imply equal outcome for equal work, but they just want equal equity.
Yep.
The work that goes in is irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
Equal outcome for everyone.
Yep. No matter what.
regardless of work.
Exactly.
It's interesting though, because every Marxist that's ever been in power has not given equal economic.
No, they are loaded.
Well,
I mean,
everyone's created equal, but some are created more equal than others.
right, I mean, Stalin and, the current Chinese government,
Yep.
the communist government of Cuba that.
Yeah, or North Korea, all the citizens.
Equal economic prosperity for the
All the citizens in North Korea are told that Kim Jong-un is skinny and starving like them.
Right.
And some see him and they go, oh, he's actually fat. Like, what the? So, utopia, an existence of total equality of outcome. Differences are seen as the ultimate threat. So again, this idea of God-ordained diversity, diversity in ethnicity, diversity in intellect, diversity in opportunity, diversity in resources, that's a threat to them. We can't have that diversity. And they have no framework by which to justify diversity and equality being two things that you could hold together. But we have that framework because we have a God who is a unity and a diversity. But they don't have that. A state of no suffering or pain. So apart from God, obviously, they think that human evolution and technology and socialization is going to do this. So increase the technology, increase the medical advancements, and we're going to somehow create a society where there's going to be no more pain and suffering. So in an imperfect world, it requires an omniforce to create it. So someone with all power, someone with all knowledge. If you want utopia, you have to have an omniforce. And that's why the government becomes that force. They act as God, and that's why you have large militaries, because they need to be omnipotent. They need to have all the power. That's why they have extreme surveillance systems, because they need to be omniscient and omnipresent. And you see this in communist China with the social score. They have cameras everywhere, and they have facial recognition on those cameras. So if you walk into a store and you buy 2 bottles of wine, and the camera recognizes your face, it will automatically register in this database that you bought 2 bottles of wine, you're likely a drunk, and your social score is going to go down. And if your social score goes down, that means that you will probably not be able to get hired for certain positions or certain jobs. And if you have been identified by the Communist Party as a Christian, then you basically have a 0 social score and you can't get hired for anything. So they need to have these extreme surveillance systems. We saw this in Russia as well in communism. They would bug houses, they bug apartments. They were listening all the time. Maybe you've read the book 1984. We're actually going to quote from it. But again, Big Brother's always watching through the televisions. So the state becomes a messianic force. All anyone needs, the state provides. Here's some quotes from Joe Boot. man needs order, certainty, and salvation. And where God's governance is denied, man will attempt to mimic it. And he goes on to say, but why is inequality, moral differentiation, diversity and variety such a horror to man's utopia aspirations? First, we must notice that the doctrine of God is inescapable. If man pretends God is dead, his need for the doctrine of God does not disappear. It is transferred from the transcendent to the immanent realm. Now central to the doctrine of God is the unity of the Godhead. God cannot be divided against himself. In the Christian faith, we have one God in 3 persons in perfect relational unity, fully representative of each other and equally ultimate. Satanically inspired thought always counterfeits these doctrines because they are inescapable categories. So both the doctrine of God and the kingdom of God are counterfeited in utopianism. Second, the idea of alienation is critical to the utopian worldview because it suggests man is alienated from his true being. This idea is not new. It is as old as ancient Greek philosophy. In Plato, we are offered the form-matter scheme. Form or idea produces the copies in the tangible world, which are increasingly imperfect in proportion to their distance from the original. Man is therefore alienated from the idea of man, and as such cannot find unity within himself. So it's chaos. So the goal of utopia is oneness. Not just oneness in individual nations, but global oneness, one government, global media, global education system, global language, global homogenized culture. You probably heard the term one world order. Like, they want that. That's the goal. It's evil and it's satanic, actually. One collective unified people where the individual does not really exist. We're all just one unified, homogenous, gross group, I guess. Connected consciousness through technology. So they're thinking that technology could advance so much that we could implant some type of way to connect our consciousness and our thoughts. And so that is certainly a goal of theirs. The goal is transcendence and godhood, to be omniscient and all-knowing and transcendent as God is. Since God is made immanent in man, the judgment of man becomes immediate. Oh, I didn't finish that statement. Becomes immediate. So Joe Boot says this: whenever man usurps the attributes of divinity and seeks omnipotence, he creates his hell on earth. And those he claims to be liberating become victims of the vindictive wrath of a counterfeit God. So they have no belief in an afterlife, obviously. So we would believe that God is going to bring true justice in the life to come. But them, they don't believe in that, so they need to have true justice today. And so they pour out their wrath. The counterfeit God, the government pours out their wrath immediately on anybody who would resist their ideology or their goal. That's, again, why you have lots of people dying. 2 more slides left. We're going to read George Orwell here quick. Maybe you've read 1984. Power is inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Do you begin to see then what kind of world we are creating? It is the exact opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that the older reformers imagine, a world of fear and treachery and torment, a world of trampling and being trampled upon, a world which will grow no less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world will be progress toward more pain. Already we are breaking down the habits of thought which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between child and parent and between man and man, between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer, but in the future there will be no wives, no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality. Like the renewal of a ration card, there will be no loyalty except loyalty toward the party. There will be no love except the love of Big Brother. There will be no, I don't know what that's supposed to be, beautiful, benevolent art. No literature, no science. When we are omnipotent, we shall have no more need of science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, no employment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston, always there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always at every moment there will be the thrill of victor, the sensation of trampling on the enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So George Orwell was obviously very prophetic in his writing, and that really is the goal. That is the product of utopianism in a fallen world. And so this brings us to our final slide, the new morality. So what is the new morality for the social justice movement? these postmodernists and these Marxists, it's this. Any action that seeks to create equality of outcome and overthrow hegemonic power structures is the new morality. So whatever it takes, killing, looting, burning the streets down. So this is social justice. This is social justice, the overthrowing of hegemonic power structures. So again, if it's burning or looting, whatever it is, if it's said to overthrow it, then we got to do it. Now, as it pertains to the white hegemony, the work of anti-racism is the new morality. So we as white people are called to do anti-racist work. That's what we can do. The one must first, but before you can do anti-racist work, you have to first become woke with the help of CRT, and I didn't put it on there, and intersectionality. So we're going to stop there. Next week, we're going to start right into CRT, intersectionality, and wokeism. What are those things? That's where we're getting into the good stuff.